When trauma becomes PTSD, it is as if a large energy mass has collided with our identity and ruptured the sense of self. Now, to backtrack a little bit, the sense of self is our habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and appearing. We look in the mirror, and if we see the same person we saw the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that, we have what's called a stable identity. If we look in the mirror and the body has been damaged or impacted or feels different in a way that we don't know this new body, if the betrayal, if the grief, if the loss is such that we don't know this person, meaning our thoughts are different than the thoughts we have known before. The feelings are different from the feelings we've known before. As a result, our behavior and our words are different. And we look into the mirror, literally and or figuratively, and we realize we don't know who's there, number one. Number two, we realize that whatever is there and whatever was there before is unstable, meaning the very nature of trauma is the encounter with a large energy mass that disrupts our sense of identity, our routine, our logistics, our sense of rank in the world. So you can have a financial trauma that destroys your financial identity. You can have a political or a public trauma that destroys your sense of public image. You can have a relational trauma where the person you've been in a dance with for months or years at a time, where you've been orienting yourself around a partner, suddenly you're dancing alone, and the moves that you made before are now insane because you're in a vacuum. And so the identity that you were before the loss collapses because there's no one to play ball with, mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually. And you become a different person, whether you want to or not, which creates the feeling of helplessness. Now, helplessness and pain and overwhelm combine to create one of the most horrific and painful human states imaginable. Because you're in overwhelming pain and you're helpless to do anything about it. That's the kind of pain that can drive someone crazy. Most of the time that craziness is short-lived, but it's the kind of pain that drives people to addiction, to highly reactive and compulsive behavior, to ruminating and going around in circles. And one of the phenomena of PTSD and trauma is the rumination of the pain. Now, there's still a lot of research to be done on how and why exactly all of these things occur. But one perspective, knowing that, to go back to identity, we need a stable identity, meaning we need a certain part of our life and a certain part of our habits of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and appearing to be relatively automatic. Because the conscious mind, the decision-making brain, doesn't have the bandwidth to learn everything, digest everything, and think about everything from scratch every single minute. You can think of the conscious mind as a narrow beam surgical spotlight that addresses issues that aren't working and allows you to edit that part of the identity, your pattern of response to that area, until the crisis is addressed in some way. If you're desperately lonely, the primary pain in your awareness, your conscious awareness, will be loneliness. And the loneliness alerts you to the fact that that's where I need to give some attention. Now, one of the breakdown points and areas of collapse into PTSD comes when you find yourself in a double bind. For example, a child finds themselves in this double bind when at 6 years old they do something that wasn't against the rules yesterday, but today dad's drunk, and so today it is against the rules. So you have the element of volatility and uncertainty. That's terrifying for a child. And you have an unregulated giant. That's a drunk father. And suddenly the child is hit with a force of energy that communicates to the child, you're big, I'm small. I depend on you, you're undependable. You could kill me, and you're mad, and I have nowhere to go. So as the child is registering the violation, the trauma, the betrayal, the helplessness of that energy, a healthy child will assert a defense. Stop hitting me. Stop doing that. But when you're dealing with a giant in a sociopathic state, first of all, they're self-absorbed. All traumatized grown-ups are incredibly narcissistic because trauma is very self-referential. If you're in trauma, and usually there's an underlying trauma for all addiction. So why is dad getting drunk? Is it really that pleasurable? I mean, grape juice tastes better than beer. So what's the draw to dissociating to that degree? Usually dad's got some memory, some feeling, some repressed trauma that he wants an escape from, that he wants to break loose from. And dissociation through alcohol, drugs, pornography, compulsive gambling, whatever it is, offers a reliable way to distract from an area that is an emotionally and psychologically illiterate man in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate culture. He's just found that when he's doing this or that activity compulsively, he's not thinking as much about the trauma, or if he is in the split attention of the compulsive behavior and the background drone of pain and shame and memory, the memory is not hitting him full on. And meanwhile, the little boy has needs, is not the cause of the original trauma or the psychological illiteracy that's leading to this coping mechanism. But the way the giant feels that is, I'm desperately trying to escape and manage it, and you exist. And your existence draws me back out of my compulsion, to have to deal with you. And I can't do a good job of that. So I feel shame. I feel anger. I feel more helpless. And then I decide, as every narcissist does, to blame the child for that feeling. Because I'm already overloaded as drunk dad, as dad trying to cope with past memories and aggravations and stresses and possible eviction or whatever it is. So you're now the trigger point as a 6-year-old for all my helplessness. The very thing that I would do anything to avoid feeling. You fucking kid. And hit you. Now, sometimes this goes into a feedback loop. In other words, what bounces back at dad, having hit his 6-year-old, is the vague awareness that he is an abusive and incompetent father. Shame hits him in the backlash. You say, "Stop hitting me," it hits him still harder. How does he get out of that feeling? Don't you dare sass your father. And he hits him again. Baby erupts into helpless shock and tears. Now the father is enraged for a 3rd time because he's getting the message that he's terrorizing and bullying a 6-year-old, which some part of him grasps is abuse, is incompetent, is a sign that he's not doing a good job as a man. And that may be the very message that he's getting drunk to avoid. So he feels like no matter what, this fucking kid just keeps hitting him with this message, I'm no good, I'm no good, I'm no good, just by existing. And so you can get a feedback loop where the more the child reacts, the more the father punches the shit out of that child. Now, what's that like to be a child and to realize you're surrounded by sociopathic giants that are abusing their authority and you can't win? And the more you react, the more you get hurt. Well, some part of the child grasps the correlation and shuts down. I'll just go limp. I will not defend myself, and maybe my father will stop hitting me. So that works. You didn't talk back anymore. You didn't assert your boundary. You didn't educate a moron. You stopped defending yourself. And the pain went down. So now you're 30 years old, 40 years old, and someone in a position of power, dealing with issues, of course, in a trauma-illiterate world that is filled with undiagnosed and unprocessed trauma. So now you've got that giant energy coming at you again for existing. Well, you're now 30 and 40, but the minute that energy signature hits you, the facial expression, the intensity of the voice, suddenly you're 6 years old again. Because you didn't deal with it then. You had no way through those feelings. To be in your body in that moment is absolutely terrifying. And so your body tells you to go limp, to not fight back, and maybe you'll live. Now, in a reptilian capitalist framework, in a reptilian fight, flight, freeze thing, in a traumatized cult, the reptilian brain is often taking the lead decision-making role. And what the reptilian brain does with fight, flight, and freeze is it attacks what is perceived as a battle it can win. So this is the, proverbial thing, don't show weakness. Why? Because if you're in an engagement with a reptile and you run, what you communicate to the reptile, to the reptilian brain, in the sociopath, is that you think you're smaller than them, and that if there was a conflict, you think you would lose. Because reptiles always run when they're in an adversarial encounter with something bigger than them. And they always fight and dominate in an adversarial relationship where they think they can win. So the fact that you run or turn communicates to the reptilian brain that you believe you are smaller. This is what goes on in, an encounter with a bear or a wolf or something. They say, don't run. Why? Because the moment you turn and run, you've taken the brain of that reptilian brain that's in a predator, and you've told that brain that you've done the calculations, and in a conflict, it'll win. Now, the reptilian brain, if it will win, fights. If it will lose, runs. Fight, flight. If it can't do one of those things, run or fight, it freezes. And like playing dead as that 6-year-old little boy, there's nowhere to go. Dad's got a hold of the scruff of his neck. So it just goes limp. So you have fight, flight, freeze, and the going limp is a sign of running, not asserting boundaries, not fighting back. Now, if that was the only way you lived, or thought you did, you wouldn't have stayed alive if you hadn't gone limp, if you hadn't collapsed. Then when you're dealing with a predator in a reptilian environment of conflict and adversary, the minute you don't fight back or don't assert a boundary, it's experienced as weakness. So then they push harder, and then you collapse more. And a reptile, a sociopath, will keep pushing to exploit the relationship. This could be in a sexual dynamic. A man starts molesting a woman. If she falls into her traumatized little girl and freezes, he'll say, okay, I can win this one. This is a dominance game. I'll do whatever I want. And in a financial agreement, if the customer or if the negotiator on the other side says, I want half price on the house, and you collapse. Let's add the furniture in as well. Let's do a 30-year loan with 2% interest, and at half price, and you leave all the furnitures and you're out tomorrow. If there's no sense of humanity because you're dealing with a traumatized reptile, then the more weakness, the more need, the more fear that they smell, the more they suck blood. Now, the more they suck blood, the more your survival is threatened. But the more you resist, the more your body tells you you're going to die. You can't resist, you're going to die. So you're in a rock and a hard place because you've got a predatorial reptile, a landlord, a rapist, a criminal, your government official. You've got a reptile, and they're in reptilian brain. So the more you collapse, the more they attack. Well, the more they exploit, the more fear you have. But the biggest fear of all is I'm going to die if I fight back, because I'm in that memory. I'm no longer 30 and 40 years old. Well, your identity as a mature person has collapsed, meaning you're watching this with the conscious mind, and you're watching yourself destroy your life by not defending a boundary, while your body is screaming, don't fight back, don't fight back, don't fight back, give in. And the reptile on the other side is seeing that you're giving in and is exploiting that moment as much as they can, whether that's a casino, whether that's a dating environment, whether that's a landlord-tenant relationship, whether that's a business deal, whether that's a family situation. Who's gonna take care of mom? Well, if you collapse, the more someone unfairly treats you because you can't fight back, then you're going to end up taking care of mom, feeling terrified, and often to assuage the guilt of the other person, then being blamed and piled on and listed all your faults and this and that and the other. At the end, you're holding the whole family bag. You're holding it all. You get nothing but shame and contempt. And there's that energy of aggression behind it that you can't fight. Well, you can't hold an identity with honor there, because you can't face the terror of a 6-year-old confronting a giant who's drunk, who could kill you, and some part of him wants to, because you exist. You can't face that. So you can't grow up. You've frozen, you've partitioned that trauma at that age, and now you're facing all confrontation as a 6-year-old. No one's got your back, and you feel completely exposed. Why? Because you were at 6 years old. Mom had left or was off doing something else. She knew Dad was getting drunk, and she took herself out of the house so that he could abuse who was near him, and she wouldn't be there. You don't get a sense of safety and protection when your caregivers let a 6-year-old take the brunt so that they don't have to feel their feelings, so that they don't have to deal with it. So now you're in this bind. And you can't get through it at 6 years old. And you're trauma illiterate. And so what you've got is the contempt of the locker room boys hammering down at you. You're a wuss, you're a weakling, you deserve it. The 6-year-old won't fight that bully in you because it doesn't want to die. And you don't know what hit you. You know, this is the crisis of human interactions all over this country on a regular basis. And when your identity, your sense of certainty and stability is vulnerable and collapses, you've got to have some sense of stability. the more terror you have, the more certainty you need. And the identity is typically that's me in the mirror. I behaved that way yesterday, now I behave this way today. The identity is what would normally anchor you, but you weren't prepared for or expecting the attack of a big one. And you don't understand trauma, so you don't know why you're regressed. You realize you are helpless to sustain your identity in that environment because the identity field, the pattern, collapses. The pattern of thinking, the pattern of feeling, the pattern of speaking, the pattern of action. Even your posture, it all disintegrates in the face of that re-triggering event. So at the very moment you need the most certainty because you're traumatized and re-traumatized, you have lost your sense of self. You have lost the coherent pattern of identity, which leads to frantically looking for stability. Now, one form of trauma is please. You have fight, flight, freeze, and please. Now, the pleasing identity is, I don't know how to get out of this, but if I'm nice enough to the predator, the wolf comes into my house, here, have some chicken, don't eat me, have some chicken, you want some chicken, anything I can do? The gang member walks into the restaurant, 2 guns hanging off the hip. Word on the street is they just shot another 3 bystanders who saw a crime. The gangster walks into your restaurant. Now we're in please mode of the reptilian brain. It's fear-based, but it basically says, here, you can have, don't worry about human decency and the fact that this table was reserved. Don't worry about the fact that you're out of line. We'll please you, just don't shoot up our restaurant. Well, this is fear-based, and so this can happen in the dynamic. What do I have to do to please you? But a reptile will exploit that and push that and push that. There's you'll see this escalation in abusive relationships. First, it's the sarcastic remarks, then it's the odd slap in the face, then it's some punchings, now it's a gun under the pillow, now it's don't move or I'll shoot you, constant contempt, because a reptile is pushing and escalating the fight. The more you flee, the more you don't hold your own. If in that first interaction of that kind of reptilian dynamic, if you're dealing with a reptile, if you get a restraining order, get a gun, put up security cameras, leave a will, send it to your predator, an insurance policy dedicated to hunting him down if they kill him. You see, once you become bigger than they are, or just bigger than other prey, they flip, the reptilian brain flips from flight or from fight to flight. Meaning, if someone wants to sadistically dominate and abuse a woman, there's so many traumatized women to choose from. Why pick the one who's got $1 million life insurance claim to hunt down her killer with a restraining order, with things, who calls the police, who learns karate and carries a pistol? Give me a break. So many people willing to be raped and dominated and apologize. I'm so sorry I got in your way. And so as you become, when you're dealing with a reptile, as you become bigger, too dangerous to fight, you run. You're still in fear, you're still a sociopath, but The cue is saying, I may not want to mess with this one. And so the behavior shifts to running. The trouble is, when you were 6 years old, you couldn't get it together to put a restraining order on your father. You couldn't have survived if you did. The cult isn't designed to take care of innocence. So the foster home you got sent to might very likely be worse. Might involve sexual abuse. So you don't have any options. So at 6-year-old, you form the strategy of collapse and go limp. From the moment you lived, your body says, go limp or you die. Well, you may look at this rationally, but trauma is not a rational phenomena. And so when you've got traumatic responses of fight, flight, freeze, and please driving you, one of the most frustrating, helpless feelings is watching yourself treat, for example, your most abusive customer better than your best customer out of sheer terror, because you were never able to stand up to the bully. It's like, oh gosh, you want a 30% discount to verbally abuse me, and you're going to tell me it's not good enough, and this. I mean, my best customer pays on time, praises the work, this, but I'm watching this and I'm saying, this is sick, this is wrong, that's an asshole, and why am I going along with it? Because the driving identity is a trauma identity, and the driving pattern is what kept you alive. And what kept you alive at 6 years old is destroying your career at 40 years old. But you're not trauma literate, and neither is anyone else in your world. You're not emotionally literate. You're not psychologically literate. You're in a chauvinistic cult where if you talk about these feelings and being out of control, you lose social rank. There's another slap in the face. You acknowledge the obvious, that I've been traumatized, disoriented, cross-wired, set up to fail, and then dumped out in the world without a single hour of competent emotional training? Well, that's a fact. You acknowledge the obvious cruelty of that with a little hesitation and overwhelm and stammer, and suddenly you're being met with contempt, the contempt of the chauvinist. Oh, they have feelings. They're confused. They're not confident. Go get it together. Where exactly do you suddenly become psychologically literate? In a psychologically illiterate abuse cult, where exactly do you get it together? Because your cult doesn't have it together. If they did, there would be training for your abusive parents and some degree of certificate needed to take charge of the innocence of a little child. You'd get emotional training in school when you actually needed it. You'd be a safe alternative if the cult fucked up and didn't teach your parents how to avoid abusing you. And you would have it together because your cult had it together. You would be emotionally literate because your cult was emotionally literate. So this pattern of identity collapse is one of the most vulnerable aspects of trauma, because if you've got that hold your breath and freeze dynamic to avoid the predation of a giant, there's no force field that can send the message psychologically, verbally, physically, and financially, back the fuck off. This is a boundary. If you don't want to be dead, You're not crossing it. You see, to that collapsed 6-year-old, you just committed suicide. You stood up for yourself. And the projection is not of them as, another adult who's fucked up like you are. The projection is of that parental giant. So that's, the 6-year-old is nuts at this point. You've just signed us up for murder. We can't defend ourselves. It hasn't gotten the message you've grown up because it's still dissociated. It's still frozen because the circuit tripped at that point. The memory became a loop that stopped integrating with the other thoughts and memories because it was too intense to deal with. If you're 6 years old and you grasp that for the next 12 years of your life, you are in the hands of a sociopathic, incompetent giant who sometimes wants to kill you and has very little idea what they're doing. That's the truth, but that is a truth that a 6-year-old cannot accept, because the obvious response to that is to get out of that house and have your own house and put a restraining order and separate. That's the adult response to that type of situation. But the 6-year-old isn't an adult. So it does the opposite. I'm unlovable. I'm bad. I deserve to be punished. This giant is perfect. All the pain I'm experiencing must be about me. Now that's something a 6-year-old can grasp. I'm fucked up, but I've got a competent giant looking out for me who hopefully loves me, at least says he does when he's not drunk. And I'll figure out how to fix my flaws later, but in the meantime, I've got someone, a giant on my side. Now, if you believe that, you go crazy, but you also feel safe because it's something you can do. You can do what you're told and believe that that'll work out in the end, even if it doesn't work out in the end. So, collapse of identity. Now, as your identity collapses, as you lose coherence, and you can no longer find yourself, you can't hear the pattern that is you because you're busy trying to please and hear the pattern of your abuser, because you're lost in the memories of terror that nobody taught you how to deal with. Well, the unknown of having no identity, of no pattern, is terrifying in this wilderness of horror, of fear, of overwhelm. And so one of the things that people latch onto is something solid, anything solid. And the most solid thing for a traumatized person is the memory of the event that was traumatized. It becomes a loop. It was seared into their body, seared into their brain. So the traumatic identity is the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and looking that you witnessed, that you felt during the trauma. I don't know who I am, I don't know who I am. I'm the trauma. I don't know I'm the trauma. You keep remembering the trauma, and it answers the uncertainty. It answers the dread and the terror. And so you now know who you are. You're now the trauma. You're now the worst moment of your life in an endless loop, but I know who I am. It's solid. It doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps going round and round. Now my entire identity is wrapped up in the trauma, but I have certainty. I know who I am. That's a relief. And it can't get any worse. Believe me, it can't. When you cease to identify with who you were before and start to identify with the traumatic loop, and you just hang on there, white-knuckled, I'm not letting go of this, you've got certainty, which medicates the helplessness. You've got known, which medicates the fear of the unknown. But you're stuck in the worst moments of your life, and that becomes who you are. Now, as soon as you start to let go of that, there's the terror of the unknown that surrounds the trauma. I don't know who I am. And for most, the chauvinism of the cult, the violence of the cult, the reptilian and sociopathic elements in the cult make the fear of the unknown more terrifying than any known pain. Now, if every time you've kind of stepped out and grown, started to fly a little bit in your world, you've been hit hard by forces bigger than yourself, you are terrified of the unknown. And you'd rather the devil you know than the devil you don't. So you hang on to your traumatic identity for fear of being lost in the unknown, for fear of going insane. That's one possibility. Because when dissociation with reality, etc., is one reasonable response to overwhelming trauma without relief. Do you want to be sane and get exactly how screwed and stuck you are, or do you want to be insane and you can go off into spiraling personalities and words, etc., and people stop demanding things of you because they get that you're crazy, and some people abuse you and some people are nice to you, and few people see you as a threat if you've lost it. So there's a big attraction to going insane, and some people will go there. There's a big attraction to addiction, and some people will go there. There's also a big attraction to hang on to what's most solid, which are the most intense feelings, ideas, and moments of my life, which is my trauma. So now I'm in PTSD. I'm in a loop that goes on endlessly and holding on there. So as you let go of that identity, you face the disorientation, the dissociation, the overwhelm, the grief, the pain, and you don't know who you are. Because we all look for an identity that is self-referential and stable. And when trauma hits us over the side of the head, what its message carries is, you are not safe, you cannot defend yourself, you are vulnerable to losing yourself. Because wherever that energy came from that traumatized you, you didn't plan it. It's not like you said, let me show up here at 2 p.m. and be rear-ended by a car and knocked into horrific pain, then have my husband leave me because I have an amputated leg, and then have my husband turn my daughter against me, and then have the landlord evict me because I'm now a single person in pain with high medical bills. You didn't schedule that 2 p.m. spiral down in a sociopathic framework, where the more you hurt, the less valuable you are in a reptilian framework, the more you are to be preyed on or discarded. You didn't plan that. And so to go back to that identity of who I was before feels risky. Because who I was before wasn't stable enough to just stop that landslide. And the helplessness is the worst part of it. So the human ego is always in search of a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and appearing that is stable, that is self-referential, and that leads to more well-being. But the beginning point is stable. The next point is self-referential, that it comes from within rather than from without. And the third point is that it feels good. Well, trauma, if you identify with your trauma, it's self-referential because that's your memory. and your body and your pain. And it's stable. It's the most intense thing in your memory field. So no one can knock you out of trauma. And if they do, it doesn't feel any worse. You're already in trauma. But the trick of post-traumatic growth is to find a new identity, a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that stably, sustainably increases your sense of well-being, the thing that every human being wants and always has wanted and always will. I want stable, consciously generated fun, joy, satisfaction, well-being. To get someone in PTSD to let go of the red-hot handlebars of pain and trauma that are so stable in their loop and face the overwhelming unknown as a regressed child and develop baby steps in a new identity is one of the greatest miracles one can witness. But if you're surrounded by reptiles, self-centered, narcissistic, abrupt, insensitive, shaming, sociopaths, in a scarcity mentality in which you are seen as a burden, it's too terrifying to make that transition. But it is literally the journey that every infant had to do. They had to develop an identity. And the traumatized person post-trauma has to find a superior pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and appearing than the one they had that was knocked over, that incorporates the learning from the trauma, that leads to a better reality. That's the perilous journey. And just like a 2-year-old needs a kind mother to slowly go out into the deep waters again and find that gentle place, find the self-confidence from experience. Someone with PTSD has no confidence in certain areas because they've just failed, and confidence comes from sustained success. You know, you drove a car and you were confident because you didn't have an accident. But the moment you realize that there is absolutely no way to stop the next car from plowing in you the way the last one did, you lack confidence to come home in one piece. Because as much as you analyze, did I put my blinkers on? Was I driving the speed limit? Had I taken my car in for a checkup? I can't improve that. Some maniac at any moment can not just crash my car, but I lost my husband, who then turned my daughter against me. I lost my house. I lost my job because of something completely out of my control. And it could happen at any time. And in that state of utter helplessness and loneliness, I was surrounded by self-centered, cruel, narcissistic family members and psychologically illiterate people who took this time to vindictively gain rank because I needed them. And that is so hellish. I'd rather die early. I'd rather commit suicide than live in a world where this just helplessly happens over and over again. And there's no peace, and no one grieves the horror of that experience. This is why identity, the forming of identity, the shattering of identity with intense unregulated energy that violates the identity, the fallout, the loss of identity, the loss of self. I don't know who I am. I thought I did, but that was robbed with the explosion. I'm 2 years old, but I have no clear pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, to know what should I do here. I know the old identity didn't work. It didn't keep me alive. It didn't protect me. It didn't protect what I love about me and in my world. So I'm looking for an identity, a pattern that can protect me in a psychologically illiterate and sociopathic cult that has no hope to offer me other than grow up, get on your feet, see if it happens again, and be prepared to be punished for this state. That's the crisis of PTSD. And a humane cult, a traumatically literate cult, understands that this is worse than death. That going through trauma surrounded by reptiles is worse than death. So you don't complain about the fact that more people are committing suicide in the United States that die in car accidents. You wonder why the number isn't higher. And what you complain about is, when are we going to have an hour a week of trauma and psychological literacy in every week of high school at a time many of our children are being systematically and pathologically abused to the extent that they start cutting themselves and shooting up on distractions.